All right. Hello. Welcome back to another Classic Comics live stream and another Trek Talk. Today I'm going to be looking at, in production code order, this would be episode 11, Miri. Not one of my personal favorites. Hello, Lord Thoth. Good to see you, sir. Thank you for stopping by again, as always. All right. I'm not a big fan of Mary. I'm going to just say that up front. But before I even get into that, let's talk a little bit about, as usual, I'm going to be reading from These Are the Voyages by Mark Cushman for behind the scenes information. So it was at this point in Star Trek's history that Gene Kuhn joined the show. And Gene Kuhn would certainly go on to be a vitally important person in Star Trek's history. He invented a lot of the things that Roddenberry got credit for, such as Klingons and the Prime Directive and various other things. But I'll go ahead and read a bit from the book here. Quote, "It is just impossible for one person to produce, write, and look over a show so extraordinarily complex as Star Trek," Roddenberry said. What it became during the first half of the first year was a full-time script rewriter, and you just cannot do that and in addition fulfill all producer functions. Roddenberry first called James Goldstone, who was the director of Where No Man Has Gone Before and What Little Girls Are Made Of, to try and get him to take on the producer role. The next invitation went to Samuel Peoples, who was the writer of Where No Man Has Gone Before, and he produced some Western shows such as Overland Trail and The Tall Man, who said, "I had to decline. I had two series of my own in development, and so there was no way I could work with Gene." The third call went to Fred Freiberger. In Roddenberry's opinion, Freiberger had found the right mix for the Wild Wild West 1 year previous, a show which was part Western, part spy show, and part sci fi. Freiberg later said, "I was going to Europe and I didn't want to cancel my trip. I told Gene that if it was still available when I got back, I'd do it, but of course it wasn't." The fourth call went to another veteran of the Wild Wild West, Robert Justman, who said, quote, "Gene was fatigued and so was I. We both nearly didn't make it through the first season because of overwork. We were at our wits' end. Honestly speaking, Gene would have died if they hadn't had Gene Kuhn come in to do this." One of Gene Kuhn's first credits as a screenwriter was 1957's Man in the Shadows, a Western that starred Jeff Chandler and Orson Welles. That same year, he started writing for television with the Disney series Zorro. Script assignments soon followed for Mr. Lucky, Bonanza, Wagon Train, and many others. Kuhn also had a hand in the development of two hit shows. The first was McHale's Navy, which was planned originally as a 1 hour drama. The studio liked the concept, but not the script. Kuhn had the idea to retool the show as a half-hour comedy. He was given credit for writing the pilot script and a second episode, but not for creating the show. When it premiered in October of 1962, McHale's Navy was not only a hit in the ratings, but with critics. The second series he created was also for Universal and was designed to exploit the studio's Frankenstein movie sets by merging them with an unlikely source, another studio property, the long-running and wholesome sitcom The Donna Reed Show. This outrageous idea was Kuhn's all the way, but his script was handed over to Bob Mosher and Joe Connolly, who had great success producing Leave It to Beaver. This time it was Kuhn's concept that got retooled, and it eventually became The Munsters. Kuhn was paid off, and Mosher and Connolly took the created by credit. Kuhn didn't seem to be bothered. The studio did owe Kuhn a shot at producing, however, and assigned him to the 1964 mid-season replacement series Destry, a 1 hour Western. When Destry failed to find an audience, Kuhn was imported to CBS to take the reins on its network-owned fantasy western, The Wild Wild West, where he finished out the first season before being lured away from TV to write a pair of scripts for the big screen. Moving back to television, he tackled 11 script assignments over the next 2 years. These included comedy and science fiction on shows such as My Favorite Martian, The FBI, 6 episodes of Laredo, and 3 episodes of Combat. Quote, Kuhn was a sensitive, kind man once you got to know him well, Leonard Nimoy said, but on the surface he came across as a crusty James Cagney, Spency Tracer type, the sort of guy you'd see cast as the tough 1940s newspaper man. Dorothy Fontana saw a different Gene Kuhn entirely, saying, quote, Gene, no pun, was probably one of the most genial men I've ever met. He was rarely without a smile. I think he was just happy to have survived the Marines. Kuhn began as producer of Star Trek on August 8th of 1966. His first task was to take over the rewriting of a script Roddenberry had approved and since had been struggling with. Okay, and of course that episode was Miri, which was originally written by Adrian Spees and directed by Vincent McAvity. This comes from the October 4th, 1966 press release. The USS Enterprise discovers another Earth, whose childlike inhabitants are victims of an abortive experiment to retard normal aging processes in Miri on NBC Television Network's colorcast of Star Trek. Captain James Kirk, Mr. Spock, and Dr. McCoy had a landing party to an uncharted planet with the physical characteristics bearing an incredible resemblance to Earth. They befriend Miri, played by Kim Darby, a disheveled and frightened young girl whose story of the failure of a mass youth experiment is questioned until their own lives are imperiled when they lose communication with their spacecraft. Miri, who is nearing puberty, soon develops a crush on Captain Kirk. She'll have her first love close at hand for a short while anyway. Kirk and his landing team cannot return to the ship. They are showing symptoms of having contracted the same infection that was responsible for eliminating the entire adult population of the planet. As in Lord of the Flies, this episode takes a disturbing look at a culture run by children. The themes deal with modern society's obsession with youth and the inherent dangers in man's attempts to alter the forces of nature. This was the second time members of the Enterprise crew were infected with a disease, the first being the naked time. This time, the disease lets us examine the price of humans attempting to prolong or drastically alter their lives. Even in the world of 1966, the scientific and medical communities were experimenting with such technologies as cloning and the development of life-altering drugs. America, as with most Western cultures, had become obsessed with youth. The divisions between the generations seemed to be ripping America apart. Miri, with its onlys and grups, was another Swiftian way to place a lens on the changing times. There are flaws. The chance of the kids, especially that blah, blah, blah business, becomes annoying. Yes, it does. The blotches that vanish from McCoy's face, although not a bad effect for the time, could have been made to diminish more believably. And the parallel world the Enterprise encounters, that other Earth, should at least have some clouds in its atmosphere. These points aside, Miri is entertaining and dramatically effective with an intense and highly personal drama for Kirk, Rand, McCoy, and especially Miri. Entertaining and dramatically effective. I don't know about that. I question that. Okay, let's go ahead and we'll get into the episode itself here. Give me, here we go. All right, so the Enterprise receives a distress call, and while investigating it, they discover a planet that is basically another Earth, and not just Earth-like, but another Earth, right down to the continents. In this episode, we see Africa and we see North America, so it's basically just a duplicate of Earth, which it's sort of surprising that that never came up again. As far as I know, there's probably novels that revisit this or something, but at least in canon, quote unquote, they never came back to this other planet for any other story. Okay, so Kirk and a landing party beams down with McCoy, Spock, Rand for some reason, and a couple of red shirts. And they find what is basically appears to be a dilapidated and abandoned version of a North American town circa around 1960. And I love this little bit here where Kirk finds this old tricycle, sort of rusted and falling apart, and he hands it to Spock for no particular reason. And I love the look on Spock's face here. He's just like, "Why did you give me this thing?" And he quickly passes it off to McCoy. So McCoy is examining it, and then he is attacked by this person who appears to be sort of mutated. They get into a scuffle with this guy, and then he starts crying and whining about how the tricycle is broken, acting very childlike. And then he has a seizure and he dies. Subsequently, they hear what appears to be voices chanting, and they check a couple of buildings, and eventually they find a young girl who tells them her name is Miri. And well, first, Kirk sends the Spock and the red shirts out to search around. And then they talk to Miri. And uh, Miri talks about how uh, the onlys are grown-ups. I'm sorry, the grups are the grown-ups. They're all violent. And Kirk notes that he and the other adults haven't hurt them, and assures Miri that he and the others won't hurt her. Now, as they speak with Miri, they begin to understand that there was a plague of some kind that killed off the adults but left the children alive. And then the episode gets a little, shall we say, uncomfortable, as Kirk basically begins rather openly flirting with Miri, which is just really, it just seems really inappropriate. And I mean, what were they thinking? I don't know. Let's see. Where was I here? Okay. So, meanwhile, Spock and the red shirts are searching for other people, and they hear the children chanting repeatedly. Spock and the red shirts try to chase them down. At one point, the children throw rocks and other debris at them from the rooftops, but they can't seem to find these kids. They just kind of scurry away and hide every time they get close. Spock comes back and reports what he found to Kirk, and they decide that they need to go and find some records that might shed some light on what might have happened here. Kirk asks Miri if he knows about any buildings where doctors worked and that sort of thing. And she says she knows and she can take him there. But then he notices this purple kind of lesion on his hand. And Mary says that he's got the sickness, that all the other grups had or grown-ups had, and says that soon he'll become just like them. He'll become very angry and violent and start hurting people, and then he'll die. So they do eventually find some sort of research facility, and McCoy finds some medical equipment. So he starts trying to find learn more about the virus. Hello, Adega. Hey, man, thanks for stopping by. Always good to see you, as always. And eventually the lesions start appearing on all of them. So he gets tissue samples from all of them and starts examining them. And let's see here. So they eventually discover Kirk and Spock find lab notes that indicate that on this planet about 300 years ago, people were experimenting with some sort of techniques to prolong life, like genetic experimentation. And they figure that's obviously something went awry, and that's what caused the mass die off. And I got to say, it's pretty fortunate that, on this whole planet, they just beamed down to the town that just happened to be where the original experiments were taking place, because it's not like they're reading this stuff in a medical journal or in a history book of some sort. They're literally reading the lab notes, handwritten lab notes. So it's like they just happened to be down right where the experiments were taking place, I guess. I mean, I guess you could say maybe this was going on at other facilities too, maybe, but it is a bit of plot convenience, I think. Okay, now they discover that the experiment would lead to a person aging only a month for every 100 years or so, meaning that Miri and the other children on this world are hundreds of years old. And that also means that Miri and the other children will eventually die when they enter puberty and begin to develop this illness. Let's see. And now at this point, we finally get our look at the other kids. And the other kids are led by John, played here by Michael J. Pollard. And Pollard, you might remember, he was actually in the running to play Charlie Evans in the episode Charlie X. Now, he complains about Miri helping the Grups, and he notes that they use these little boxes to speak to each other. And John speculates that they're talking to a ship in space. Now, this is one of the plot holes I kind of have an issue with, because why would he draw that conclusion? Because we've already established at this point this world had a kind of 1960s level of development. Therefore, it's unlikely they had a space program, or if they did, it was in its infancy, and that was 300 years ago. So why would John then immediately assume that they're using these little boxes to talk to people up in the sky? Why would he draw that conclusion? But, they need him to go steal the communicators so they can set up the conflict in the second half of the episode. So Kirk convinces Miri to take her to the other kids. So they go to the building they're hiding in, but they all scurry away and hide. And then they get attacked by this girl who has now started to mutate. And she attacks Kirk. And he phasers her, but then she dies. And Kirk notes, like my phaser was on stun, she shouldn't be dead. So far in this episode, Kirk has been inappropriately flirting with a 14-year-old and also has killed a kid. So great job, great job, Kirk. You're doing splendidly in this one. Let's see here. So Spock calculates that they have about 7 days before they're going to start going crazy. And also that Miri probably has about a month or so before she'll start to have issues as well. Because since she's in puberty now, she's starting to enter the early phases of the illness. Now, then they hear children chanting, so they run around in this building trying to find them, but they don't have any luck. And while they're out searching the building, John sneaks. Oh, wait, hold on. Let me remove this. There we go. John sneaks into the room where they were keeping the communicators, and he takes them. Okay, and at this point, McCoy points out that they've got to get the communicators back because without the communicators, they can't obviously take advantage of the computers on the ships, and they need that in order to create a treatment or a cure for the disease. We then skip ahead a few days, and at this point, and I kind of enjoy this part of the episode because they get increasingly ill-tempered and sort of agitated, and they're constantly yelling and bickering with one another, even more so than usual. And I don't know, I just found it kind of funny. It's like Star Trek by David Mamet. Let's see. Okay, then Kirk bumps into Rand and knocks a flask that she was holding out of her hand. She drops it. She freaks out and runs off. So Kirk goes after her. And Miri's seeing them all getting more and more agitated, and she's just like, ah, shit, here we go. And so Rand, she's showing all these blemishes and blotches, and she's very upset. And Kirk comforts her. Miri sees this, and of course, Kirk has been pretty much just manipulating Miri emotionally, like from the start of the episode. And she sees this, and she's upset. So she sneaks away. They return to the lab, and McCoy says he thinks he's isolated the pathogen, and that means he can therefore start working on a cure. The problem is it's going to take time, and of course they only have a few days left. And again, they really need those communicators back in order that they can get this done. Because if they have the computers, it won't be a problem. And this is another thing that I have a little problem with as far as the plot, because hey, Lord Thoth, yeah, thank you. Because earlier in the episode, Kirk gives the order, "Hey, no one's supposed to beam down, to the planet under any circumstances because we've got, we don't want anyone else getting infected." Okay, that's reasonable. But I mean, again, the kids steal the communicators, and then we skip ahead like 3 days. So there's been no communication between the ship and the landing party in 3 days. And really no one up there thinks maybe we could go down. Maybe someone put on like a biohazard suit and beam down to see what's going on. Um, it just seems a bit unlikely. I would think surely after a couple of days, Scotty would be like, okay, let's find out what is going on, because surely they would have responded by now. So this whole thing that there's no communication with the ship, it kind of strains credulity to me. So Miri goes to the other kids. And she tells the other kids, she concocts this plot to lure Rand away from the others and basically take her prisoner. And of course, she wants to do that because she believes that then Kirk will come after her to try and find Rand. Okay, now Spock and McCoy develop a treatment that they believe will work. And this was another scene where they're yelling at each other. Spock's like, Captain, we really need those communicators. And Kirk's like, we're trying, Mr. Spock. We're really trying. And McCoy's like, that's not good enough. Now, he demands that Miri tell him where Rand is because Rand is missing by this point. And of course, she's like, I don't know nothing. But they do develop a cure. But the problem, of course, is they don't know what dosage. Well, they think it's a cure. They don't know, but they think they have a cure, which, of course, needs to be tested, but they don't know what kind of dosage they should use. So Kirk talks to Miri and convinces her to take him to where Rand is. And then they discover she's got the blotches on her arm as well now. She is developing the sickness as well. So then we see where they've got Rand all tied up, but Miri leads Kirk there, and then Kirk appeals to the kids. And boy, these kids are annoying. They are annoying as hell. I mean, I kind of don't fault him. Like at one point, he grabs one kid off of a desk and basically just throws him to the ground. I'm like, okay. I mean, if I were that kid's parent and I was there and saw him throw my kid like that, I'd be very upset. But it's not my kid, and the kid was annoying, so I'm like, yeah, good, throw it. But he tries to appeal to them, and then they like beat the crap out of him. Then he tells them and exposes, his arms and shows all his blotches. Yeah, beatings all around. Yeah. Um, Yeah, that's one of the things about this episode is these kids are so annoying. I mean, they are really irritating. But I mean, they're supposed to be. They're supposed to be these, feral, basically. Completely unruly and all that. So it makes sense, especially that one kid that's always going bonk 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 bonk. It's like, God, shut the hell up, kid. Whew. And then Mary shows John her blotches and says, because Kirk's telling them, look, you're all going to get this disease too eventually. So you've got to let us have those communicators so we can make a cure. I mean, personally, at this point, I would just grab John and twist his freaking arm and tell him, like, look, you little effer, give me those communicators. But John's still unconvinced. Then he points out that the kids are the ones who are being violent. The kids are the ones who are hurting people. Then they cut back to Spock and McCoy. And McCoy is insisting they need to go ahead and test this thing. And Spock says, look, we don't know if this will even work. Yeah, not exactly. Yeah, parenting probably is not my forte. Okay, so then McCoy decides to go ahead and test the serum on himself. So he injects himself, then he passes out. And then Kirk arrives with the communicators and with the kids. Better late than never, I guess. And then they check McCoy, and the blemishes on his face begin to disappear. So it appears that the treatment has worked. And this is another part of the episode I don't care for. The ending is really kind of clunky because it ends very abruptly. Because then it's like, oh, okay, everything's fine now. Kirk gets up and he like smiles at Miri and then walks off, and Miri and John are like, oh, good, everything's gonna be fine. It's like, okay, and McCoy's still laying there unconscious. The ending is not handled well, in my opinion. Then we skip ahead a few days and we learn that the Federation's going to send, like people to help these kids, to educate them and give them medical care and all this stuff. And Rand makes says something about how Miri really loved you, Jim, or something like that, and Kirk's like, I don't get involved with older women, and it ends there. So this is directed by Vincent McAvity, written by Adrian Spees, as I said. Again, this is the first time produced by Gene Kuhn will appear on the show, with Kim Darby, Michael J. Pollard, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the book now. And as I say, yeah, this is not one of my personal favorites. This is the first episode I'd say that I really don't really care for, and I really would not care to rewatch. Okay, so Adrian Spees uh, began as a reporter and feature writer for the New York Mirror. Now, once he made the move to television, and by the way, I would ask also, please, if you would like the stream if you haven't already, and also do sub if you haven't already. Um, yeah, he started as a writer for the New York Mirror. Then he made the move to television and wrote for many other prestigious anthology series from the 50s, including the Dick Powell Theater, Climax, and Studio One. More than merely keeping busy in television, Spees was considered a star writer who was in great demand. And he was very well thought of by Desi Arnaz. Spees often wrote for Desilu Playhouse, and Arnaz honored him with an invitation to write an episode which would showcase the studio boss's dramatic acting ability. But Spees was not a science fiction writer. This was alien territory for him, and with Miri, he was clearly borrowing from other sources. Consider this a kind of a blending of William Golding's Lord of the Flies with Richard Matheson's I Am Legend, which, I hadn't thought of that before I read this, but when I read that, I was like, yeah, that does kind of make sense. That is what it is, sort of. Speece recalls, quote, when I went to see Gene, I offered him the idea of a bunch of kids in this place where they are permanently young, but they're actually very old. He said, you have to develop a language for these people. I said, what are you talking about? And he said, the kids would talk differently. In that conversation, he made up the word grups for grown-ups. I immediately liked it. That's an example of a creative producer at work. He had good ideas and good contributions. We worked out the story together. Roddenberry and Spees were in immediate agreement that Miri's world should be described as another Earth. This allowed for contemporary Earth-like locations and clothing to be used, thereby saving money. It also explained the use of English as the children's language, and it was hoped that this would better help the TV audience empathize with the children. Let's see, let me skip ahead a little bit here. Okay, so John D.F. Black didn't see what all the fuss was about, saying, quote, the idea of Miri was absolutely intriguing and fascinating, and it felt wonderful right from the get-go. It was there from the first draft, and Adrian kept it there throughout. He was easy to work with because he was a consummate professional. What it would take 10 minutes to say to somebody else, you could say to him in 30 seconds, and he would have a clamp on it and know exactly what you meant. We were lucky to get him. Now, this episode went through a lot of rewrites and a lot of development, and each writer the writers were contracted for a certain number of rewrites, I think 2 rewrites. So they went through all the rewrites, and then he had fulfilled his obligations, so Spees moved on. And then it was given to John D.F. Black to polish the script up. He did his contractually required polish, which was dated August 10th, and at Roddenberry's insistence, a second polish was done. The final draft, which was dated August 12th. But John D.F. Black wouldn't be making further changes. His final draft was truly final. The day of its delivery, Friday, August 12th, was Black Friday at Star Trek. Black's contract was up and he would be leaving the series. Dagger of the Mind was now in its 4th day of production and with 2 more days planned for the following week. but the script needed a rewrite, and Roddenberry didn't have another one left in him. Including Miri, there were 6 episodes remaining at NBC's order of 16, and it was now clear that Star Trek needed a new producer. And Adega says, just messing around in the kitchen, potato cakes with chives, and New York strip reduction with red pepper. That sounds good. Yeah, I had a pretty good meal yesterday for Memorial Day. Uh, Beef ribs and baked potato with like everything. It was pretty good. And Adega says that he'll be on and off. That's cool. Thank you, man. Always glad to have you here. Okay. Help arrived a few days earlier, which, as it would turn out, was for the filming of Miri was a few days too late. Gene Kuhn came to Desilu to sign a contract on August 8th, and he would take over as producer, starting with the filming of Miri, allowing Roddenberry to work a little less obsessively from the chair of the executive producer. Kuhn spent the balance of the week getting a crash course on Star Trek, a series that had yet to broadcast a single episode. On the weekend, he did his rewrite of Miri, bringing his cut and paste revised final draft in on Monday. Let's see here. Okay, so now Tom Grease, who had produced the science fiction movie Donovan's Brain and also directed numerous episodes each of Science Fiction Theater, Route 66, and Stony Burke, was the last of the 9 directors that Gene Roddenberry had signed back in May to handle one Star Trek episode each. Grease had been slated for Miri, but as had been the case with Bernard Kowalski during the period in which The Naked Time was planned and filmed, he had a scheduling conflict. The well regarded director could not be blamed. It was Star Trek that was falling behind, resulting in the changing of production dates. A decision was quickly made to hold Vincent McAveety over from Dagger of the Mind, which he had just directed, giving him only 2 days instead of the normal 6 days for pre production of the episode. Gene Kuhn had until Monday to get notes from the network and feedback from Roddenberry and Justman and do the final polish of the script, with revised pages flying from his typewriter on August 17th, 18th, and even as the cameras were rolling on August 22nd. McAveety said, I thought it was a very involved script and it was tough putting it together so quickly. I think they cast the quirky guy, Michael J. Pollard, unbeknownst to me because they wanted him and they had to make a deal with him fast or lose him. But Miri herself, I was involved in. I just looked at film. She didn't even come in to interview or audition. She had decent film, and we were in enough of a hurry because I never met her personally until we began making it, which is why I had no idea of what to expect, good or bad. Kim Darby, in a captivating performance, was the shy, love-struck Miri. She was 18, playing 14. Starting in 1963, she had small roles on television, which quickly grew to substantial ones as she proved her abilities on Dr. Kildare, Mr. Novak, and The Fugitive. She moved to the big screen and worked with James Doohan in the 1965 film Bus Riley's Back in Town. In 1969, she would have second billing to John Wayne in True Grit, which is probably what she's best known for today, I would imagine, her part in True Grit, and would share top billing with William Shatner in the 1972 sci-fi thriller The People. Joe DaGosta said, quote, Kim Darby was a real coup for us because she was an actress who could do very odd parts. Darby delivered these victim-like characters with such ease. Because it was Star Trek and the nature of the show, the nature of the kinds of roles, we were able to get her interested. Michael J. Pollard as John was 27, but was also playing 14. Pollard's big break came in 1958 when Bob Denver, who played the beatnik Maynard G. Krebs on The Many Loves of Dobie Gillis, was drafted into the Army. Pollard was brought in to replace him as Maynard's weird cousin Jerome Krebs. It would be a short stay, however, as Denver flunked out of the armed services as a 4F and return to Gillis very quickly. Pollard's character was quickly written out, but the exposure helped catapult the oddball personality into other TV and film jobs. And I know he's popped up in a lot of things over the years. Um, Let me see. There they are. But that actor, Michael J. Pollard, he's been in a lot of things. Like I always think of him, he was in what was it, Scrooged? He played the homeless guy that dies in Scrooge. And one thing, he was on Superboy, that syndicated Superboy show. He played Mr. Mxyzptlk actually on 2 episodes of that, in addition to a lot of other things. He's just one of those character actors that pops up a lot. Pollard played in '65. Pollard played another teenager in The Magic Mirror, a surprisingly somber and charming episode of Lost in Space. DaGosta said, Michael was a one of a kind. You either loved him or hated him because he was so, for the lack of a better term, quirky, odd, but interesting and unique. He brought the same performance to every job he did, unquote. Okay, and now as for the other children, not surprisingly, a lot of people from the show brought their own kids in to play the rest of the kids in the cast. These included Darlene and Dawn Roddenberry, Steve McAvity, the director, his nephew was one of them, and William Shatner's daughters, Leslie and Elizabeth, were there as well, and Grace Lee Whitney's 2 sons, Scott and Jonathan, were also part of it. Now, one professional child actor in it was John Megna. He plays the annoying bonk bonk on your head kid. And it says here he was actually the brother of Connie Stevens, which I didn't know. And another one of them, can I see it? I guess that's him back here. Yeah, that must be him back here. Let me check some of the other stills to see if I can get a good look at him. Okay, I can't get a clear look, but there's only like 1 or 2 kids that are not white in this, and this kid's one of them, and he's an African American boy. I think he's the one right back here. So apparently, this kid was Phil Morris. Phil Morris was the son of Greg Morris, who was appearing on Mission Impossible at the time. And Morris would go on to have a pretty good career. He would return to Star Trek. He would play Cadet Foster in Star Trek III: The Search for Spock. And I believe he would be the one early in the film when he's asking, when they're returning to space dock, and he says, "Are they going to have like a big welcome for us, sir?" And Kirk's like, "A hero's welcome. Is that what you'd like? Lord knows we deserve it. We've paid with our dearest blood." And he would return to Star Trek again as a Klingon commander and as a Jemadar warrior in episodes of Deep Space Nine, and would also appear in an episode of Voyager. And he would also actually play Grant Collier, the son of Barry Collier, the character his father played in Mission Impossible for that series revival in the late 80s. But these days, he's probably best remembered for his role as the slick lawyer Jackie Chiles on several episodes of Seinfeld. Who told you to put the cheese on? I didn't tell you to put the cheese on. You people with the cheese. It never ends. Okay, Ed McReady played the boy creature in what would be one of 5 appearances. His most notable role is he played the barber inspector of the gun as well. And Jim Goodwin, let's see if I can find him here. Actually, I don't believe he's in this one. Let me remove this and let me go back. There he is. So Jim Goodwin, he would come back to play Lieutenant Farrell again, and this would be his 3rd and final appearance. John Art was one of the 2 red-shirted guards among the landing party. He was given the names Fields here. See, can I find a picture of them? I don't know. I may not have a still with both the cars. I mean, that's probably the only one I've got with both of them in it. This would be one of four appearances for this. Prior to this, he appeared at the beginning of The Man Trap playing the crewman Sturgeon, one of the victims of the salt vampire. And the other security guard was played by David Ross. This would be the first of 8 appearances by him on Star Trek. Now, for this episode, of course, they used this town set here. And this was on the Desilu backlot, which was known as 40 Acres, which I guess was formerly owned by RKO Pictures in Culver City. The backlot once belonged to Selznick Studios and had been the locations for the burning of Atlanta in Gone with the Wind, as well as the home of Tara, the Southern Mansion. In 1966, it served Desilu for the outdoor filming of numerous TV shows, such like they had the sets for Camp Henderson from Gomer Pyle were located here, as well as Stalag 13 from Hogan's Heroes. This was also the site of Mayberry in the Andy Griffith Show. And it was this location, Mayberry, that serves as Miri's world. The Enterprise landing party actually is walking on the streets of Mayberry with buildings appearing abandoned and desolated. Sheriff Taylor's courthouse can be seen in the background, as well as the town bank and Floyd's barber shop. Okay, so this episode premiered on October 27th, 1966. And it got absolutely crushed in the ratings because it turned out that that night was also the night that saw the network premiere of It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown, which easily won the night in the 8:30 to 9 time slot with a 49% audience share. So almost half the TV sets in America were tuned to It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown that night. Star Trek came in a distant seventh, or at least the first half, at a 25.4. And then the second half hour actually came in second to Bewitched. Or actually, no, it was third because Bewitched and the Thursday Night Movie were in almost a tie. Let's see. When the Peanuts special cleared the air, a great deal of channel surfing raised Star Trek's audience from a 25 to a 28.3 rating. Miri was a well-liked episode, not only by the fans, and not by me, not by this fan, but by those responsible for making it. However, when ranking all the episodes in Star Trek in a special November 1994 issue of Entertainment Weekly, the magazine's writers said, quote, "The annoying bonk on the head kid should be sent to military school pronto." Agreed. Adrian Spees commented, Miri looks good. It had kind of a sincerity to it. Gene was dealing with all the causes at the time in a very thoughtful and intelligent manner. I have only good things to say about Trek and my experience on it. I just wasn't very much into science fiction at that point. Vincent McAveety said, quote, "A wonderful love story. It had touching performances, and it's another example of how a good story can take place 200 years in the past or 200 years in the future. And the time frame doesn't matter as long as we are moved by the characters. Mary was one of my absolute favorite films. I thought it was very special." Okay, so that's kind of it on that episode. But I do want to talk about some other things here because this kind of comes at a turning point of sorts for Star Trek because not only did Gene Coon come onto the show, but there were actually a lot of personnel changes taking place. I'll talk about that in a second. For Miri, I'll give this one a grade of, I don't know, C minus, I guess. It's not horrible, but I personally just don't care for it. And like I say, it's one that I'm not really interested in revisiting, to be totally honest. It's just the kids are annoying. There's too many plot holes that don't make sense. Kirk just, manipulating this girl. It just seems very inappropriate, obviously. Um, yeah, just not a favorite. But anyway, so I had mentioned earlier that when it came time to film this episode, the show was behind schedule. It was behind schedule and also going over budget. And the costs of the show were actually going up with the addition of new staff. Adding further complication, the scripts for Shore Leave and City on the Edge of Forever were far overdue. Renowned science fiction writer Theodore Sturgeon was at work on the first. The equally renowned and notorious Harlan Ellison was laboring over the second. Both men, while immensely talented, were not delivering pages at the speed Star Trek needed. And there was another problem. John D.F. Black wanted out. The Star Trek associate producer and script editor and his then wife and now, or then secretary and now wife, Mary Black, have told their side of the Roddenberry Black fallout during interviews. Black has given other interviews over the years, and the message has been pretty consistent. His 4-month stay on Star Trek from mid April to mid August of '66 was a hellish experience. Black had grown more disenchanted each week, believing that Roddenberry's rewrites were damaging many of the scripts. Black admired writers such as Jerry Soule, Richard Matheson, George Clayton Johnson, and Robert Bloch. He felt Roddenberry's displayed less talent than these men and should not be changing their words. Examination of the various drafts of the scripts for these episodes gives indications that some changes were for the better, some perhaps not. But generally, it is more of a case of personal taste. Regardless, Black had other issues beyond the caliber of the writing. He later said, I realized there was just no way I could stay here. I gave the writers my word that they would get to do all their changes first before we did any of our own, because Gene told me I could tell them that. And then he would change everybody's scripts without letting them know. There wasn't a script he didn't screw with. Mine, Bob's, Richard's, George's, every script. And every time he did it, it became more and more clear to me that he was making my word bad. Every time I said to a writer, hey, you get to do this. This is a show for a writer. This is a writer's show. And he made my word bad. I was dealing with great writers too. Harlan Ellison, Ted Sturgeon, Richard Matheson, Robert Bloch. It made no sense to me. The straw that broke the camel's back and Black Spirit was when Roddenberry rewrote The Naked Time. This was Black's baby, his first and only original script for the series. And Adega says, that would seriously suck. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure that it's part of the business and they would know that. But again, the fact that Roddenberry would just kind of do this unilaterally, which, being the executive producer, obviously he's going to have the authority to do that. But as Black says, it puts him in an untenable position where he's telling the writers this one thing because Roddenberry said you can tell them that, and then that's not the case. And certainly for John Black, I can see why he felt like I can't keep doing this. Being so closely involved with Star Trek and entrusted to rewrite other writers' scripts, such as Mudd's Women and Miri, Black believed that he would be spared having his material reworked by Roddenberry. No. No, you wouldn't, sir. I could fight for the other writers, Black said, and I always did. I'd go into Gene's office and sit across from him and tell him how I thought he had screwed someone's script up. Sometimes he'd listen, sometimes he wouldn't. Sometimes these meetings would last a half hour, sometimes for hours at a time. But he wasn't going to have that kind of a conversation with me over my script. He just changed it. Mary Black said, quote, toward the end, the tension over the rewrites was filling the air. So a few weeks before the exit, John and I had a conversation and decided that we were going to ask for the moon if we were to stay. We wanted Bob Justman's office with the bathroom. We wanted a written promise from Gene Roddenberry that he wouldn't do any rewriting unless such and such. We wanted a very inflated salary. I can't remember all the goodies we asked for, but we wanted a lot. John said we were prepared to say yes if they were willing to give us the moon, then we would stay. but we didn't expect them to, and they didn't, so it was a happy exit. Black's work for Star Trek ended with a rewrite on the Miri script and a first draft of what would eventually become the Menagerie. Ironically, Black's title for his version of the script was titled From the First Day to the Last. Both were delivered on August 12th. Black's contract expired 2 days later on a Sunday. But Black was not the only person who would be leaving. Robert Justman was the next to fall. He had been pushing himself beyond the limit, arriving at the studio at 5 a.m. and not leaving until 7 or 8 p.m. in the evening. Once home, he'd eat a quick dinner, then continue working by reading scripts and dictating memos. And he'd do this until he pretty much just fell asleep. Quote, all of a sudden I find myself without the strength to go on, Justman later acknowledged. Everything hit me at once. My own ability to function for more than 20 hours a day just kind of slammed into me. Justman experienced a breakdown one night while sitting at the dinner table. Quote, I was just began weeping. At the same time, I was trying not to make any noise because I was embarrassed and ashamed for being so weak as to give in to these emotions. Justman's wife, finding him in this state, poured a double scotch into her husband and then called Roddenberry and read Gene the Riot Act. Bob and Jackie Justman were sent to Hawaii for a week of R&R by Roddenberry. Meanwhile, the work continued. Roddenberry said, I don't think there's a person who has worked on this show who has not said to himself, I'm taking a calculated risk with my health. I could die of a heart attack because of the strain of this work. Shatner said, a series starts off with a great idea, and then time and fatigue affect everyone. So all everybody's trying to do is get the words out, to occupy 52 and a half minutes of film time. To do a halfway decent series is a Herculean task. Nimoy said of that first season, quote, my days were beginning to blur together. Working on a series is, to indulge in some Vulcan-like understatement, grueling. And DeForest Kelley said, the first year was very hard work. It almost killed us all. Now, John Black, while at Star Trek, had been pulling double duty, first as one of the series' associate producers, and second as the show's story consultant and script editor. And again, I'll remind if you haven't liked the stream, please do like before you go. And if you haven't, please do sub to the channel if you're enjoying it. Okay, so Gene Kuhn had taken his place with the upgraded title as producer, but Kuhn wanted help, and therefore that meant someone else designated as script consultant. Stephen Karabatsos began working in TV just 3 years earlier when he placed a spec script with the show Ben Casey. That first sell ushered in a couple of additional assignments on primetime soap opera Peyton Place. Or I'm sorry, on Ben Casey, and this led to a handful of script jobs with the Big Valley. The Big Valley! I remember that one. A short tenure on the primetime soap Peyton Place followed. Science fiction was not something Karabatsos was deeply interested in. Roddenberry and Kuhn were clearly taking a chance on their new script editor. Therefore, he was offered a contract for only 13 weeks, commencing from August 8th of 1966. If the series was renewed to finish the season and things hadn't worked out with Karabatsos, he would be gone before the final episodes of season 1 were shot. Immediately after filming of Miri in early September, Roddenberry met with Bob Justman, Herb Solow, and Bernard Wurtzman, Desilu's VP of Business Affairs. Star Trek was having money problems. The show had a new producer whose salary was greater than what John Black's had been, and the production staff had increased with the additions of both Stephen Karabatsos and Eddie Milkis. And there was another new expense. DeForest Kelley's character of Dr. McCoy had worked out so well that he was now wanted for nearly every episode produced from this point on. So they were going to have that additional expense. In addition, Scotty, Sulu, and Uhura were also working out well and wanted for more upcoming episodes. But Desilu was looking to cut costs. Someone or something had to go. D'Agosto sent a memo to Roddenberry. Grace, for the most part, has cost us a lot of money for the little that we use her in each show. The character is one that, if cast with a freelance player, would cost less and would hold as much value. I suggest that we drop her option and use her on a when needed and if available freelance basis. Roddenberry agreed that Yeoman Rand was dispensable. Whitney herself saw this coming and said, "They were starting to write me out of scripts because they thought that the relationship between Bill and I looked too close for him to then be able to cheat while on away on other planets. In other words, it would look bad for him to fool around with all these alien babes. They thought the audience would be upset with him if he cheated on Rand because there was clearly something going on between these two. But she didn't expect that the character would be taken out of Star Trek altogether, nor did Robert Justman. He was against losing her and was surprised as he saw it that Roddenberry made no effort with Solo and Weitzman to fight for Grace Lee Whitney. Her agent got the news from Desilu Business Affairs. The contract would not be renewed. Yeoman Rand was not being written out. She would simply disappear. Whitney had been guaranteed only 7 episodes, and she had already filmed 6. A final screen appearance in an episode of Star Trek would be so brief that few even noticed her presence. The official word was that the character hadn't worked out. Rumors circulated that the actress had not worked out either. In her book, The Longest Voyage, Whitney gave a darker reason for her termination. Following the wrap party for Miri, the actress accompanied an unnamed studio executive back to his office to discuss ideas he had concerning her character. Both had been drinking. The friendly get together turned ugly. The executive wanted sex. Whitney wanted out. Her future with Star Trek, she believed, depended on what she did next. She gave in to the executive's demands. Days later, the call came in from her agent. She was being taken off the show. She said later, quote, "I've always believed that the executive had me removed from Star Trek because he didn't want to be reminded of what he did to me that night. In other words, I was sacrificed on the altar of one man's lust and guilt." The curious handling of Yeoman Rand's last appearance in this series supports Whitney's suspicions. The actress's role for the next episode to film, Conscience of the King, was downsized to a cameo, even though she was to be featured prominently. And Adega says she got screwed. Well, yeah, yeah, it's an ugly situation. I remember reading about that in Star Trek Memories, Shatner's book. Which, when did that come out? Like mid-90s, I think. And I remember him mentioning something about that, about how she had been basically sexually assaulted by a studio executive, although that was never, and even in here, it doesn't ever say who this person was. But it says studio executive, so I'm assuming this is someone at Desilu, not at NBC. That would be network executive, I guess. And yes, timescales, Greatly Whitney. Yeah, unfortunately. Okay, so the actress's role for the next episode, Conscience of the King, was downsized to a cameo, even though she was paid to be featured prominently. At the time of her sacking, Whitney remembered that DeForest Kelley and Leonard Nimoy being very supportive, but they were powerless to keep her involved with the series. I think it's interesting that she says DeForest Kelley and Nimoy, but not Shatner. Interesting. Even Roddenberry and Justman seemed to lack the necessary clout to keep her around. Whitney said, quote, "Gene had told me that he let Rand go against his will. He did not want to let Rand go. He wanted to keep the romantic conflict between Kirk and Rand going. Maybe I wouldn't have been in every episode, but I wasn't contracted to be in every one of them anyway. Rand had a lot of strength and a lot of guts. I think her character could have been further developed." Unquote. Timescale says, "I thought I'd read everything about the making of TOS, but never heard of that." Yeah, it was in like I mentioned, Shatner mentioned that in Star Trek Memories. And it says here, I guess Grace Lee Whitney wrote her own book about it. about her time on Star Trek, or probably about her career in general, but surely Star Trek was the main thing. In a memo to Gene Kuhn dated October 28th, 1966, Roddenberry wrote, Bob Justman and I both think we should look for an opportunity to bring Grace Lee Whitney back as Yeoman Rand in some upcoming episode. We might discuss at that time the possibility of trying some slightly different hairdo, something more on the order of what she had on Police Story. It actually made her look younger and softer. But a certain power that be at Desilu did not want this, and Whitney would never return. Nichelle Nichols had survived the first cut. Despite this, for Nichols and her character, it had been a roller coaster ride. Days before filming began on the Corbomite maneuver, a contract was quickly drawn up between Nichols and Desilu. Before it could be signed, however, the offer was quickly withdrawn. In her book Beyond Uhura, Nichols cried bigotry, basically saying it was racism that motivated them to withdraw the contract offer, although they would eventually make a new offer. The simple truth was that Nichols' contract rescindment came down to a matter of money. Roddenberry had been giving out contracts too freely, and now the studio was reining him in. He had promised Nichols 1,000 per episode. After only a couple of episodes, those he answered to at Desilu, not NBC, were rethinking this handshake agreement. The episodes were coming in over budget, and cuts had to be made. Nichols' salary then was reduced to 140 per day. If she was needed for all 6 or 7 days required to shoot an episode, she'd make more money than with the previous arrangement. Gene kept on writing her in, Bob Justman said, saying that Roddenberry would tell him, Michelle's great and she's not that expensive. Someone else could cost a whole lot more. At the same time, Roddenberry was writing Majel Barrett back into the series, and in order to get away with this, turning up the heat on NBC by telling tales about how the network had rejected number one on grounds of her gender. Roddenberry had conveniently forgotten that NBC execs, for both financial and moral reasons, had always favored a strong woman as a series star, her solo insisted. NBC just didn't want Majel. They knew she was his lover, and they resented having her forced upon them. In time, the network brass would retaliate. Okay, I think that's enough. So, yeah, we're over an hour. So I'll go ahead and wrap it up there. So next week will be episode 12 in production order, which is The Conscience of the King. And I'll probably talk some more about, because this is around the time that the press push for Star Trek really began. And the actors started doing personal appearances and stuff like that. And I'll talk about that a little as well, probably. Desi, maybe sounds like him. I don't know, man. I mean, you can't rule it out, but I wouldn't want to say. I really don't know. I don't. But the thing is, I think, was he even with Desilu anymore at that point? I don't know. What I'm trying to remember when because I think that by the time Star Trek started, he and Lucy had already gotten divorced, didn't they? I thought they did. Maybe I'm wrong. All right. Well, and again, before I go, if you haven't liked the stream, please do like and also sub to the channel and check out some of my other videos while you're here. And again, Trek Talk will be back next week, and I will see you all then. Have a good evening, and thanks for tuning in.